The stagecoach driver had warned her twice before he left her standing in the dust of Prosperity Gulch, Wyoming Territory, in the spring of 1878, and Alberta Donnelly had ignored him both times, which was how she came to be sitting alone on an overturned crate outside the mercantile with her trunk beside her, and not a single soul in sight who seemed inclined to help. "You will want to move along before dark, miss," the driver had said, tipping his hat with the particular haste of a man who had a schedule to keep and no patience for a woman traveling alone. "This ain't a town that waits on newcomers." She had thanked him anyway, because her mother had raised her to be polite even when politeness was wasted on a fleeing stagecoach. And now, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the dust settle over the rutted street, wondering exactly how she had come to be 26 years old and utterly alone in a town she had never seen before, answering an advertisement from a rancher she had never met. The advertisement had said his name was Silas Ralston, and it had said he needed a wife who could cook and keep accounts and did not mind hard work, and it had said nothing at all about whether he was kind, or whether he smiled, or whether he would want to hear about the journey she had taken to get here. 3 weeks by train and coach from Ohio, past mountains that had taken her breath clean away and rivers that had frightened her half to death when the coach forded them. She had written to him for 4 months before deciding to come, and his letters had been short, so short that she had wondered more than once if he resented the ink he spent on them. But there had been something in the shortness that she liked, an honesty to it, as if he could not bring himself to promise more than he intended to deliver. Now, as the sun began its long slide toward the western hills, she heard the creak of wagon wheels and looked up to see a man driving a buckboard down the main street, a man with sun-darkened skin, and a hat pulled low and shoulders that looked as though they had spent a lifetime carrying more than their share. He did not stop the wagon so much as let it drift to a halt in front of her, the horses tired and dusty, and he looked down at her for a long moment before he spoke. "You are Miss Donnelly," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said, standing and brushing the dust from her traveling dress, though it did little good. "And you would be Mr. Ralston, unless there is some other man in this town who is expecting a mail-order bride to arrive on the afternoon coach." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but close enough that she counted it as a small victory. "I am Silas Ralston," he said. "I own the Circle R about 6 miles north of here. I have come to fetch you, since it appeared no one else was inclined to." The driver was in a hurry, she said. He did not seem overly fond of Prosperity Gulch. "Few men are," Silas said, and swung down from the wagon to lift her trunk into the bed with an ease that suggested it weighed nothing at all, though she knew for a fact it weighed a great deal, since she had packed it herself and complained about it the entire journey. "We should go. It is a fair ride, and I would rather not be caught out after dark." "Is there danger in that?" "There is danger in most things," he said, and offered her his hand to help her up onto the seat, and said nothing further on the matter. She took his hand and found it rough with calluses, warm despite the cool evening air settling over the town, and she settled onto the seat beside him with her skirts arranged as best she could manage, and waited for him to say something else. He did not. He merely clicked his tongue at the horses and set them moving, and the wagon rolled out of Prosperity Gulch and onto a road that seemed to stretch endlessly into hills gone gold and violet with the dying light. And Alberta Donnelly, who had never in her life been comfortable with silence, found herself sitting beside a man who seemed perfectly content to let it stretch on forever. She lasted perhaps 10 minutes. "It is beautiful country," she said. "I did not expect it to be beautiful. I expected it to be flat and brown and empty, but it is not empty at all, is it? Look at those hills. They look almost purple in this light." Silas said nothing, but she noticed his eyes moved briefly to the hills before returning to the road. "I suppose you have seen it so many times it no longer strikes you," she went on. "That is often the way of things, is it not? A person grows accustomed to beauty and stops seeing it. My mother used to say that about the ocean. though I never saw the ocean myself, only heard her speak of it. She grew up in Boston before she came west with my father, and she said that by the time she left, she had stopped noticing the water at all, though when she first arrived she used to sit and watch it for hours. Silas made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been nothing at all. "Do you have family nearby, Mr. Ralston?" "No," he said. "None at all, no brothers, no sisters." "Had a brother," he said, and the words came out flat and final like a door closing. "He is gone now." "I am sorry," she said, and meant it, though she could see from the set of his jaw that he did not wish to speak further on the subject. And so she did not press, though it cost her something, because she wanted very much to know the story behind those two short sentences, wanted to know what had happened and how long ago, and whether it still ached the way such things tended to ache. Instead, she talked about the train journey, about the woman in Cheyenne who had tried to sell her a bottle of tonic that promised to cure everything from headaches to heartbreak, about the conductor who had let her keep the window seat because she had asked so nicely, about the mountains that had seemed to rise up out of nowhere and then simply refused to end. Silas drove the wagon and said almost nothing, but she noticed that he never told her to stop talking, and once, when she described the tonic seller's outrageous claims in exhaustive detail, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, just slightly, before he turned his face back toward the road. "You do not talk much," she said finally, when the silence between her sentences had stretched long enough that she felt she ought to acknowledge it. "No," he agreed. "I have no use for conversation, never saw the point in filling air with words that do not need saying." "Then I imagine I will be a great trial to you," she said, "because I have never in my life met a silence I did not feel compelled to fill." "I noticed," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth did move just barely before he schooled his expression back into its customary flatness. The ranch house, when they arrived, sat low and solid against the darkening hills, a modest structure of timber and stone with a barn beside it, and corrals stretching out toward pastures she could not yet see in the failing light. Silas helped her down from the wagon, and she noticed he was careful about it, his hand steady beneath her elbow, and she thought that a man who had no use for conversation might still have use for kindness, and that struck her as a hopeful thing. "There is a room made up for you," he said, carrying her trunk toward the house. "I will show you where things are kept. The preacher will not be through these parts again until Sunday, so we will marry then if that suits you." "That suits me," she said, though the word marry, spoken so plainly and without ceremony, sent a small shiver through her that she could not quite name. He showed her the house, which was clean but sparse, the kind of place kept by a man who did not spend much time thinking about comfort, and he showed her the kitchen, and the well, and the barn where he kept 2 horses and a milk cow, and through all of it he spoke only when necessary, answering her questions in short sentences and volunteering nothing further. But she noticed, when she asked about the mountains visible from the back porch, that he told her their names, and when she asked about the creek that ran along the eastern edge of his land, he told her it ran dry most summers but had never failed him yet. And she thought that perhaps a man with no use for conversation might still have things he wanted to say if only someone thought to ask. That first night, she lay awake in the small room he had prepared for her, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling into darkness, the wind moving through grass she could not see, the distant call of some animal she did not recognize, and she thought about the man in the next room, who had said perhaps 40 words to her in the space of an entire evening, and who had nonetheless carried her trunk without complaint and named the mountains when she asked. She thought she might come to like him very much, given time. She thought, too, that time might be exactly what he was least willing to give her, if the shortness of his answers was any indication. But Alberta Donnelly had never in her life let a difficult silence stop her from speaking, and she did not intend to start now. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Alberta had not expected, but found herself grateful for nonetheless. Silas rose before dawn to tend the cattle and the horses, and she rose not long after to make breakfast, a task she had performed for her father and brothers back in Ohio, and one she took to with more skill than she had let on in her letters, not wanting to seem as though she were bragging. The preacher, a thin man named Reverend Hollies, who traveled a circuit through 4 counties on a mule that seemed older than he was, arrived on Sunday as promised, and married them in the front room of the ranch house with only Silas's neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Prout, standing as witness. It was a plain ceremony, over in perhaps 10 minutes, and Silas said his vows in the same flat, unhurried voice he used for everything else, though Alberta noticed his hand trembled slightly when he took hers, and she chose to find that reassuring rather than alarming. "Well, Mrs. Prout said afterward, pouring coffee for the small gathering, "I never thought I would see the day Silas Ralston took a wife. He has turned away every widow and spinster in 3 counties, and here you come from clear across the country and manage what none of the rest of us could." "I did not know I was in competition," Alberta said, and Mrs. Prout laughed, a warm sound that filled the small room. "You were not in competition, dear. There was no competition to be had. The man simply did not want a wife, not since—" She stopped herself, glancing toward Silas, who had gone very still by the window. "Well, not for a good long while." Alberta wanted to ask what Mrs. Prout had been about to say, wanted to press the matter the way she pressed most matters, but something in the set of Silas's shoulders told her this was not the time, and so she let it pass, filing the question away for later, the way she filed away most things she intended to return to eventually. That evening, after Mrs. Prout and the Reverend had gone their separate ways, Alberta found herself alone with her new husband in the quiet of the ranch house, the 2 of them sitting at the small kitchen table with the last of the coffee between them, and she thought that this, perhaps, was the moment to ask about his brother. "Mrs. Prout said you did not want a wife," she said instead, easing into it sideways, the way she had learned to ease into difficult subjects with her own family. "Not for a good long while," she said. "What happened, Silas? What made you decide to send for me?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, and she thought perhaps he would not answer, but then he spoke, and his voice was rougher than usual, as though the words cost him something to bring up. "My brother Amos and I ran this ranch together," he said. "Built it from nothing near 10 years back. He had a wife, Mary, a good woman, kind, always talking, always laughing at something. I did not think much of talk in those days either, but I did not mind hers." He paused, and Alberta held very still, sensing that any word from her might close the door he had only just opened. "There was a sickness came through 3 years back. Took Mary first, then Amos not 2 weeks later. I do not rightly know if it was grief or the same fever that carried her off, but he did not last long without her." "I am so sorry," Alberta said softly. "After that I did not much want to hear anyone talk," he said. "Talk seemed like it always ended in loss. Seemed safer to keep to the cattle and the horses, since they do not go filling a man's ears with plans and hopes and then leave him to bury them." He looked up at her then, and his eyes, which she had thought were simply dark, she now saw held a great deal of old pain in them, carefully banked but not extinguished. "I sent for a wife because the ranch needs one, and because I am tired of eating my own cooking, and because a man gets old before his time out here alone. I did not send for you thinking I wanted conversation, Alberta. I want you to understand that plainly, so there is no confusion between us." "I understand," she said, though something in her chest had gone tight and aching at the story of Amos and Mary, and at the thought of this man closing himself off so completely against the possibility of ever losing anything again. "But I will tell you plainly as well, Silas Ralston. I do not know how to be quiet. I have tried, and I am no good at it. I will talk to you whether you want conversation or not, because it is simply how I am made, and I think you will have to decide whether you can live with that. I do not have much choice now," he said, and there was the faintest edge of dry humor in it, the closest thing to a joke she had heard from him yet. We are married." "No," she agreed. "You do not have much choice, but I hope in time you will not mind it so very much." He did not answer that, only finished his coffee and stood to bank the fire for the night, but she noticed he did not tell her to stop talking, not then and not in the weeks that followed, and she took that as its own kind of answer. The weeks turned into a month, and Alberta learned the rhythms of ranch life with the same determination she brought to everything else, learned to milk the cow without getting kicked, learned which hens laid best and which were simply ornamental, learned to bake bread in the temperamental oven that Silas swore had a mind of its own. She talked through all of it, narrating her small triumphs and failures to a husband who rarely answered but who she came to understand was listening, because he would sometimes correct her when she got a fact wrong about the cattle, or add some small detail about the land that she had not known, proving that whatever silence he wore like armor, it did not stop him from taking in every word she said. She learned other things, too, in that first month. She learned that Silas Ralston, for all his silence, was a man of deep and careful kindness, the kind that showed itself not in words, but in actions so small she might have missed them if she had not been paying attention. He mended the hinge on the henhouse door before she had even mentioned it squeaked. He brought her wildflowers from the far pasture, not with any ceremony, simply setting them on the table before he went out again, as though the gesture embarrassed him and he wanted it done and forgotten quickly. He noticed when she was tired before she noticed it herself, and found reasons to send her inside to rest while he finished chores that could easily have waited. She learned, too, that he had a temper banked deep but real, and she saw it only once in that first month, when a drifter came through looking for work and made a comment about her that was not quite an insult but was not quite respectful either, something about mail order brides and what a man might expect to get for his advertisement fee. Silas had not raised his voice. He had simply stood, and something in the stillness of him, in the flat darkness of his eyes, had sent the drifter scrambling back onto his horse without so much as a meal, though Silas was not a man who typically turned away a hungry traveler. "You did not need to do that," she told him afterward, though she had been secretly pleased by it. "I can defend myself well enough." "I know you can," he said. "I have heard you talk. I imagine you could talk a man clean into the ground if you set your mind to it." A pause and then quieter. "But I did not care for the way he spoke of you. I will not have it, Alberta, not on my land." It was the longest sentence of feeling she had heard him speak since their wedding day, and she found herself smiling about it for the rest of the afternoon, though she could not have said exactly why. It was in the second month that the trouble began, though neither of them knew it at the time for what it truly was. It started small, the way trouble often does. A section of fence found down along the northern boundary, not broken by weather but cut, clean and deliberate. Silas frowned at it for a long while before mending it and said nothing to Alberta about his suspicions, though she could see something working behind his eyes. Who would cut a fence? She asked, following him along the fence line as he worked, because she had taken to accompanying him on his rounds when her own chores allowed it, finding she preferred the open sky to the close walls of the kitchen, and finding, too, that she liked watching him work, liked the sureness of his hands and the quiet competence he brought to every task. "Might be nothing," he said. "Might be someone's cattle got confused and pushed through, and I am imagining trouble where there is none. You do not believe that." He glanced at her and something like reluctant respect crossed his face. "No," he admitted, "I do not believe that. There is a man named Garrett Voss who has been buying up land along the river for the better part of a year now. He has made noise about wanting my section too, on account of the water rights. I have told him no more times than I care to count, and he has not taken it well. And you think he is trying to push you off your own land?" "I think," Silas said carefully, "that a man who wants something badly enough will sometimes look for ways to make owning it seem like more trouble than it is worth." She thought about that for a long moment, watching him work the wire back into place with steady, practiced hands. "Well," she said finally, He does not know you very well if he thinks a cut fence will scare you off land you built with your own hands and buried your own family beside." Silas looked up at her then, and something passed between them, something that had not been there before, a recognition perhaps, or an understanding, and he did not say anything, but he did not look away either, and Alberta felt her heart do something complicated in her chest that she was not yet ready to name. The fence cutting was followed over the next weeks by other small troubles. A trough poisoned, though only one cow sickened before Silas caught it and moved the herd to fresh water. A haystack set alight, though it was caught early and only a portion lost. Each incident on its own might have been explained away as accident or bad luck, but taken together, they formed a pattern that even Silas, careful as he was about accusing a man without proof, could not ignore. He rode into Prosperity Gulch to speak with the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Odom who listened to his complaints with visible reluctance and offered little in the way of comfort. "I cannot arrest a man on suspicion, Ralston," Sheriff Odom said, leaning back in his chair with the particular laziness of a man who did not want to make trouble for anyone with money and influence. "Garrett Voss has done nothing I can prove against him. Bring me proof and I will act on it. Until then, I suggest you keep a closer eye on your property." Silas came home from that conversation with a face like stone, and Alberta, sensing his frustration, did not press him with questions the way she might have on another day. Instead, she made his favorite supper, though he had never actually told her which foods he favored, and she had simply guessed based on what he ate most eagerly, and she sat with him afterward on the porch as the sun went down, saying nothing at all, which for her was its own kind of gift. "You are being quiet," he observed, after nearly 20 minutes had passed in silence. "I thought perhaps you needed it," she said. "I know how to be quiet when it matters, Silas. I simply do not think it matters most of the time." He almost smiled at that. She was nearly certain of it, the corner of his mouth lifting in the fading light. "I do not know what I did to deserve you turning up on that stagecoach," he said quietly. "I did not ask for a wife who noticed things. I asked for one who could cook and keep accounts. I can do both those things as well," she said. "The noticing simply came free of charge." "I am beginning to think it was the better part of the bargain," he said, so quietly she almost did not hear it, and she found herself unable to answer, her throat suddenly tight, and so instead she reached over and took his hand, and he let her, his rough fingers curling around hers in the gathering dark, and they sat like that for a long while, saying nothing, which somehow said everything that needed saying. The real trouble came 3 weeks later, on an evening when Silas had ridden out to check on a section of the herd grazing near the river, land that bordered Garrett Voss's property, and had been the subject of more than one heated conversation between the two men over the preceding months. Alberta had grown used to Silas returning by supper, and when the sun set and he had not come home, a knot of worry began to form in her stomach that would not loosen no matter how she tried to reason it away. She told herself he had simply lost track of time, that a cow had wandered and needed chasing, that any number of ordinary things might delay a rancher on his own land. But when full dark fell and he still had not returned, she could not sit still any longer. She lit a lantern, and against every instinct of caution her mother had ever instilled in her, she saddled the mare Silas kept for her use, a placid animal named Biscuit that she had only ridden a handful of times, and she set out toward the river in the darkness, following the trail she had walked with him often enough that she thought she could find her way even by lantern light. She found him perhaps 2 miles out, and the sight of him made her heart stop cold in her chest. His horse stood nearby, riderless, and Silas himself lay in the tall grass near the riverbank, unmoving, a dark stain spreading across the shoulder of his shirt that she recognized with sick certainty as blood. Silas! She was off the mare before it had fully stopped, stumbling to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she pressed them against the wound, trying to remember anything at all her mother had ever taught her about tending injuries, finding her mind gone entirely blank with terror. "Silas, can you hear me?" Silas, please, you cannot leave me out here alone. Do you understand me? You simply cannot. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly finding her face in the lantern light. Alberta, he said, his voice a rough whisper, you should not have come out here. It is not safe. It is entirely too late for that particular piece of advice, she said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. What happened? Who did this to you? Do not know for certain, he managed. Was checking the herd, heard a shot, did not see who fired it. Horse spooked and I came off him, hit my head on something on the way down, I think, along with whatever this is in my shoulder. He tried to sit up and failed, a grimace of pain crossing his face. You need to get help, Alberta. I cannot ride like this, and it is a fair walk back to the house. I am not leaving you alone out here, she said fiercely. Not with someone shooting at people in the dark. We will manage this together. Do you understand me? I did not come all this way from Ohio to become a widow before I have even properly become a wife. Somehow, between the two of them, they managed to get him onto his horse, Alberta half supporting his weight as he pulled himself up with his good arm, and she led both horses back toward the ranch house at a careful pace, terrified every moment that he would slip and fall, and she would not be able to catch him, terrified too of every shadow along the trail, wondering if whoever had fired that shot was still out there watching. By the time they reached the house, Silas had gone pale and silent in a way that frightened her far more than any amount of talking could have, and she helped him inside and onto the bed, and set about the grim task of examining the wound properly by lamplight, grateful beyond measure that her mother had, despite everything, taught her something of nursing before she left Ohio. The bullet had passed through the meat of his shoulder without lodging, which she counted as a mercy, though the wound bled freely and needed cleaning and binding, and Silas bore her ministrations with gritted teeth and only the occasional sharp intake of breath, his dark eyes fixed on her face the entire time as though the sight of her working was the only thing keeping him anchored against the pain. You are very calm for a woman who claims to have no experience with gunshot wounds, he said, when she had finally finished binding the injury and sat back to survey her work. I am not calm at all, she said. I am terrified nearly out of my mind. I am simply choosing not to show it, because I suspect it would not help either of us if I fell to pieces just now. That is a fine kind of courage, he said quietly. Better than the loud kind, I think. I did not think you had noticed I possessed any kind of courage at all, she said, trying for lightness though her hands still trembled where they rested in her lap. I thought you had only noticed that I talk a great deal and do not know how to stop. I notice everything about you, Alberta, he said, and something in his voice, rough with pain and exhaustion though it was, carried a weight that made her breath catch. I have noticed since the day you climbed down off that wagon and started talking before you had even properly introduced yourself. I have noticed every day since. She did not know what to say to that, and for once found herself entirely without words, sitting beside her injured husband in the lamplight with her heart hammering against her ribs for reasons that had nothing to do with fear anymore. You should rest, she said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough that she felt she might do something foolish if she did not move, like lean down and kiss him, which seemed an entirely inappropriate thing to do to a man who had just been shot. I will sit up with you in case the fever comes. You do not need to do that. I am doing it anyway, she said. I have found in my brief experience of marriage that I do a great many things you did not ask for. I have noticed that as well, he said, and this time she was certain, absolutely certain, that he smiled even through the pain, even through the exhaustion, a real smile that transformed his whole face for just a moment before weariness pulled him back under, his eyes closing, his breathing evening out into something like sleep. Alberta sat beside him through the long hours of that night, watching the rise and fall of his chest, and thought about how close she had come to losing him before she had even properly had the chance to know him, and thought too about Amos and Mary, about the grief Silas had carried alone for 3 years before she arrived, and understood with a clarity that frightened her that she could not bear to add herself to that particular ledger of loss. She would fight for this. Whatever this was becoming between them, she would fight for it with everything she had. Sheriff Odom, when informed the following day of the shooting, expressed considerably more urgency than he had over the fence cutting and the poison trough, since an attack on a man himself was rather harder to dismiss than mischief against his property. But he still could produce no evidence pointing directly at Garrett Voss, and Voss himself, when questioned, expressed shock and sympathy and pointed out, quite reasonably, that a great many men owned rifles and a great many disputes existed over land and water rights in the territory, and there was no particular reason to assume he was responsible simply because he and Silas Ralston had exchanged harsh words on a few occasions. "I do not trust that man," Alberta said fiercely, once the sheriff had gone and Silas was resting again, his shoulder healing slowly but steadily under her careful attention. Everything about him seemed false, Silas. The sympathy, the shock, all of it performed for the sheriff's benefit. "I do not trust him either," Silas said. "But distrust is not proof, and without proof, there is little to be done but wait and watch and keep the rifle close at hand." "I do not like waiting," she said. "No," he agreed, with something that might have been fondness in his voice. "I do not imagine you like much of anything that requires patience and silence in equal measure. But it is what we have for now." She did not like it, but she accepted it, because there seemed no other choice, and over the following weeks, as Silas healed and returned gradually to his work around the ranch, she found herself watching the horizon more often than she used to, alert to any sign of trouble, though none came, at least not immediately, and the household settled into a wary kind of peace. It was during this time, this stretch of careful watching and gradual healing, that Alberta felt something shift fundamentally between herself and Silas Ralston, something that had been building slowly since the day she arrived, but that crystallized now into something she could no longer pretend was simply friendship or convenience. She loved him. The realization did not arrive with any great drama, no sudden thunderclap of understanding, but simply settled into her one ordinary afternoon while she watched him teaching one of the ranch hands, a young man named Thomas who had come to help while Silas's shoulder healed, how to properly check a horse's hoof for stones. Silas was patient with the boy, more patient than she might have expected from a man who claimed to have no use for conversation, explaining each step carefully, and something about the sight of him, gentle and steady and utterly himself, made her chest ache with a tenderness so fierce it nearly took her breath away. She did not tell him, not then. It seemed too large a thing to simply announce over supper, and besides, she was not entirely certain how he would receive it, this man who had built walls so carefully around himself after losing his brother, who had told her plainly on their wedding day that he had not sent for conversation or affection, but simply for a wife who could manage a household. But she began, in small ways, to let it show. She touched his arm more often than strictly necessary. She sat closer to him in the evenings. She noticed, with a private thrill she did not examine too closely, that he seemed to seek out her company more than he once had, finding reasons to be near the house when he might once have stayed out with the herd, finding excuses to ask her opinion on matters he had previously handled entirely on his own. "You are asking me a great many questions lately," she observed one evening, as he consulted her about whether to sell a portion of the herd before winter or hold them through to spring, a decision that fell well within his own expertise and did not, strictly speaking, require her input at all. "I find I like hearing what you think," he said simply, not looking up from the ledger spread before him on the table. "You see things I do not always see, and I like the sound of your voice when you are working through a problem. It is different from when you are simply talking to fill a silence. I did not realize you had cataloged the different varieties of my talking," she said, though her heart had done something complicated at his words. "I have cataloged a great many things about you, Alberta," he said, and looked up at her then, and the look in his eyes was not the flat, careful look he had worn on the day she arrived, but something warmer, something that made her breath catch in her throat. More than I intended to, if I am honest with you. More than I thought I had room left in me to catalog after everything. Silas, she said softly, and reached across the table to take his hand, the ledger forgotten between them. I did not want this, he said, his voice rough. I want you to know that plainly, the way I have tried to be plain with you about everything. I did not want to feel anything for you at all. I told myself I would keep you at a distance, that I would let you cook and keep accounts and manage the house, and that would be the whole of it, because I could not bear to lose anything else, Alberta, not after Amos, not after watching what losing Mary did to him. I thought if I never let myself care, I could never be broken that way again. And now, she asked, though she thought she already knew the answer, could see it written plainly across his face in a way his careful words had not yet managed. And now I do not know how to stop, he said. I have tried, God knows I have tried. I have told myself every day for months that this was simply a marriage of convenience and nothing more. And every day you go and do something, some small thing, laugh at something foolish or hum, while you work or talk to the chickens as though they might answer you back. And I find myself further gone than I was the day before, until I do not think there is any pretending left in me at all. I love you, she said, the words arriving simply and plainly, the way she had learned slowly over these months, that plain truths were often the strongest kind. I have loved you for weeks now, I think, though I did not want to say it before I was certain, because I did not want to frighten you off with too many feelings when you have made it so clear you do not care for excess. You could never frighten me off, he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. I have been trying to leave this feeling behind since the day you arrived, Alberta, and I find I do not want to leave it anymore. I do not want to pretend anymore that I do not need you beyond the cooking and the accounts. I love you. I think I have loved you since you climbed down off that wagon and started talking, before you had even caught your breath from the journey, and I have simply been too much of a coward to say it until now. She came around the table then, and he stood to meet her, and he kissed her for the first time in the lamplight of the kitchen, his hands careful despite the healing shoulder, cradling her face as though she were something precious he could not quite believe was real. And she kissed him back with all the feeling she had been carrying quietly for weeks. And when they finally parted, both of them slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against hers and let out a long, shaking breath. I have no use for conversation, I told you, he said softly, but I think I have found considerable use for you, Alberta Donnelly, considerable use indeed. Ralston, she corrected gently. Alberta Ralston, if you do not mind. I believe we are married, in case you had forgotten in all this talk of ledgers and cattle. I have not forgotten, he said, and kissed her again, and this time there was no careful hesitation in it at all, only a warmth that seemed to fill the whole small kitchen, pushing back against every shadow of grief and loneliness that had lived there before she arrived. They might have stayed like that all evening, lost in the discovery of feelings finally spoken aloud, had a sharp knock not sounded at the door, startling them both apart. Silas moved to answer it, one hand instinctively going to the pistol he now kept near the door since the shooting, but it was only Thomas, the young ranch hand, breathless and pale in the porch light. "Mr. Ralston," he gasped, "there is smoke, coming from the direction of your northern pasture. I saw it from the bunkhouse and came straight away." Silas went cold and still in a way Alberta had come to recognize as his particular brand of fury, quiet and dangerous rather than loud. "How large?" "Large enough to worry over," Thomas said. "I think it might be the winter hay you had stored up near the old line shack." "That is nearly half our stores for the winter," Silas said, already moving toward the door, reaching for his hat and his rifle in the same practiced motion. "Alberta, stay here, bar the door, do not open it for anyone but myself or Thomas." "Silas, wait. I do not have time to wait," he said, though his voice gentled slightly when he looked at her, some remnant of the tenderness from moments before still lingering despite the urgency. "I will be back as soon as I am able. Please, Alberta, stay safe. I cannot lose the hay and you both in the same night." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist on coming with him, but she saw the sense in his words, saw that a burning haystack was no place for her to be, while whoever had set it, if it was indeed set deliberately and not some accident of weather, might still be lurking nearby with violence in mind. And so she nodded, though it cost her something to do it, and watched him ride off into the darkness with Thomas close behind, and then did as he asked, barring the door and sitting up through the long hours of the night with the rifle he had left behind for her own protection, listening to every sound the darkness offered and finding none of them reassuring. It was near dawn when Silas returned, exhausted and smelling of smoke, his face streaked with soot but whole and unharmed, and Alberta nearly wept with relief at the sight of him coming through the door. "The hay?" she asked, though she found she cared considerably less about the hay than she did about the fact that he stood before her, breathing and alive. "Lost most of it," he said wearily, sinking into a chair at the kitchen table. "We saved the line shack itself, and about a third of the hay, but it will make for a hard winter unless I can buy in feed from elsewhere, and prices this time of year will not be kind." "We will manage," she said, and set about making coffee for him, her hands steadier now than they had been during the long hours of waiting. "We managed before and we will manage again." "This was Voss," Silas said flatly, staring at the table as though he could see the man's face there. "I am certain of it now, Alberta, as certain as I have been of anything. First the fence, then the trough, then a bullet in my shoulder, and now half my winter feed gone up in smoke. He means to break me, one small disaster at a time, until I have no choice but to sell. Then we must find proof," she said, "enough proof that even Sheriff Odom cannot look away from it." "And how do you propose we manage that, when the man is careful enough to leave no trace of himself behind at any of these little disasters?" "I do not know yet," she admitted, "but I know that a man who has done this many things wrong is not likely to stop doing them carefully forever. Sooner or later he will make a mistake, and when he does, we must be ready to catch it." Silas looked at her for a long moment, something like wonder mixing with the exhaustion on his face. "You truly do not give up on anything, do you, Alberta?" "Not on things that matter," she said simply. "And you, Silas Ralston, matter to me more than I know how to properly say, even as much as I talk. So no. I do not intend to give up on protecting what is ours." They did not have long to wait for Garrett Voss to make his mistake, though when it came in a form neither of them expected, and it very nearly cost Alberta her life before it was through. It happened perhaps 2 weeks later, on a day when Silas had ridden into Prosperity Gulch to arrange for feed to be shipped in ahead of the coming winter, leaving Alberta at the ranch with Thomas and another hand for company and protection. She had been working in the garden behind the house, harvesting the last of the season's vegetables before the frost took them, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching and looked up to see a rider she did not recognize, a lean man with a scar along one cheek, drawing his mount to a stop at the edge of the yard. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim with false politeness. "Mrs. Ralston, I presume." "I am," she said, straightening and brushing the dirt from her hands, wary immediately of something in his manner that did not sit right with her, some careful watchfulness in his eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of a predator assessing prey. "Can I help you with something?" "Mr. Voss sent me," the man said. "Wanted to discuss the matter of the water rights with your husband, but seeing as he is not here, perhaps you and I might have a word instead." "I have no authority to discuss ranch business," Alberta said, taking a careful step backward toward the house, her heart beginning to pound though she kept her voice steady. "You will need to speak with Silas directly, and he is in town at present." "That is a shame," the man said, and something in his tone had shifted now, the false politeness dropping away entirely. "Because Mr. Voss is growing impatient, and impatient men sometimes do things they would not otherwise consider." He moved his horse forward, and Alberta, recognizing the danger now with a clarity that sent ice through her veins, turned and ran for the house, shouting for Thomas as she went, But the man was faster, spurring his horse forward and cutting her off before she could reach the door, swinging down from the saddle to grab her arm in a grip that bruised even through the fabric of her sleeve. "You will come with me, Mrs. Ralston," he said. "Mr. Voss thinks perhaps your husband will see reason if he understands what is truly at stake in refusing to sell." She fought him, clawing at his hand and screaming for help with every bit of volume her considerable talking had ever given her lungs the strength for, and it was that screaming, carrying clear across the yard, that brought Thomas running from the barn with a pitchfork in hand, shouting for the other hand to fetch help, and the commotion was enough that the scarred man, weighing his odds against 2 armed men rather than 1 unarmed woman, cursed and released her, swinging back onto his horse and riding off before Thomas could reach them, though not before Alberta had gotten a good enough look at him to describe him thoroughly to the sheriff later, and not before Thomas had gotten close enough to see the brand on the horse's flank, a distinctive mark that matched Garrett Voss's own registered cattle brand exactly. By the time Silas returned from town that evening, summoned urgently by the second ranch hand who had ridden hard to find him, Alberta was shaken but unharmed beyond some bruising on her arm, and the story of what had happened when he heard it transformed his face into something Alberta had never seen before, a cold and terrible fury that seemed to fill the whole room with its intensity. "He sent a man to take you," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet, "to use you against me. To threaten my wife because he could not break me through fences and haystacks and bullets." "I am unharmed, Silas," Alberta said, though she could see that her assurances were doing little to calm the storm building behind his eyes. "Thomas came in time, and I am unhurt beyond a bruise that will fade in a week." "He could have taken you," Silas said, and now she saw that beneath the fury lay something else, a raw and terrible fear that mirrored her own from the night he had been shot. "He could have hurt you, Alberta, or worse, and I was in town arranging feed while it happened, and I was not here to protect you." "You could not have known," she said, moving to him, taking his face in her hands the way he had once taken hers. "This is not your failing, Silas. This is Garrett Voss's crime, and his alone, and now we have proof of it, do we not? Thomas saw the brand on that man's horse, clear as day, and I can describe him well enough that Sheriff Odom will have no choice but to act." "It should be enough," Silas said, though his voice was still rough with barely controlled fury. "It should be enough for Odom to arrest him, or at the very least to bring him in for questioning that a man like Voss cannot simply talk his way out of." It was, in the end, enough, though it took 2 more days of gathering statements and evidence before Sheriff Odom, faced with a description of the scarred rider that matched a known associate of Voss's, along with the brand evidence and the accumulated weight of the fence cutting, the poisoned trough, the fire, and the shooting, finally rode out to Voss's ranch with 2 deputies to bring the man in for questioning. Garrett Voss, when confronted with the evidence and the very real possibility of facing charges for attempted kidnapping, in addition to everything else, did not prove nearly as calm and collected as he had during his earlier performance of shocked innocence. He blustered and threatened and eventually, faced with the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, offered instead to sign over his claims to the disputed water rights and to leave the territory entirely, an offer that Sheriff Odom, more interested in resolving the matter quietly than in the expense and trouble of a lengthy trial, encouraged Silas to accept. "I do not like it," Silas admitted to Alberta that evening, once the arrangements had been finalized and Voss had departed the territory entirely, bound for parts unknown with what remained of his fortune, and none of his former ambitions toward the Circle R's water rights. "It feels too easy, letting him simply leave after everything he has done." "I understand," Alberta said, sitting beside him on the porch as the sun set over hills that had, over these months, become as familiar and beloved to her as the hills of her Ohio childhood once were. "But he is gone now, Silas, and the ranch is safe, and I am safe, and perhaps that is worth more than the satisfaction of seeing him punished more thoroughly. We have our life to build." I would rather spend my energy on that than on continued anger toward a man who no longer has the power to touch us. You are wiser than I am in matters like this, Silas said, taking her hand in his. I would have wanted him to suffer for what he tried to do to you. He has lost everything he built here, Alberta pointed out. His land, his ambitions, his standing in the territory, all of it gone in the space of a week, because he could not simply accept no for an answer and instead chose violence and threats. I think that is its own kind of justice, even if it does not feel entirely satisfying. Silas was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunset with her hand held securely in his. I keep thinking, he said eventually, about how close I came to losing you before I even understood what I had. If that man had managed to take you that day, Alberta, I do not know what I would have done. I do not know how I would have survived it. You would have survived it, she said gently, because you are the strongest man I have ever known, Silas Ralston, stronger than you give yourself credit for being. But you did not have to survive it because I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and neither, I think, are you. No, he agreed, lifting her hand to his lips in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. I am not going anywhere. I do not think I could leave you now even if I tried, Alberta. I stopped pretending I wanted to leave a long while back, if I am entirely honest with you. I think I stopped the very first night you sat beside me in that wagon and talked about mountains and tonic cellars as though the whole world was made of interesting things worth sharing. I am glad, she said, resting her head against his shoulder as the last light faded from the sky. Because I intend to keep talking to you for the rest of our lives, Silas, whether you have use for conversation or not. I have found, he said, wrapping his arm around her, careful still of the healing wound in his shoulder but not so careful that he could not hold her close, that I have considerable use for it after all, so long as it is your voice doing the talking. The winter that followed proved harder than most, as Silas had predicted, with the loss of half their hay stores forcing careful management of the herd, and some difficult decisions about which cattle to sell before the deep cold set in. But they managed it together, as Alberta had promised they would, and there was a particular satisfaction in facing the hardship side by side, in watching Silas's careful competence at managing scarce resources, and in offering her own contributions, learning to stretch their stores further than she might have thought possible, learning to preserve and can and make use of every part of every animal that came through their hands. It was during that long winter, snowed in for weeks at a time with only each other for company, that Alberta came to know her husband more deeply than she had thought possible in those first uncertain months of their marriage. She learned that his silence, which had once seemed like simple reluctance to engage, was in fact a kind of careful listening, that he absorbed and considered everything she said, even when he did not respond immediately, and that when he did speak, his words carried a weight and consideration that made them worth waiting for. She learned, too, that he had a dry sense of humor that revealed itself slowly, in small observations delivered so flatly that she sometimes did not realize he had made a joke until several moments after the fact, and that once she began to recognize this particular quality in him, she found herself laughing far more often than she had expected to in a marriage that had begun with such careful practicality. They spent long evenings by the fire, Alberta reading aloud from the small collection of books she had brought west with her, since Silas's own library consisted primarily of ranching almanacs and a well-worn Bible that had belonged to his mother, and she found that he listened to novels with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, occasionally offering opinions on the characters' choices that revealed a surprisingly sharp understanding of human nature for a man who claimed to have no use for the complications of conversation. "You do not fool me any more, you know," she told him one such evening, setting aside the novel to look at him properly in the firelight. "You have no use for conversation," you said, on the very day I arrived, "but I have watched you these months, Silas Ralston, and I do not believe that was ever entirely true. Perhaps it was true once, he said, considering the fire rather than her, though she could see a faint flush of something like embarrassment coloring his weathered cheeks. Before Amos and Mary died, I do not think I always avoided conversation, if I am honest. I think after they were gone, I simply could not bear to fill the silence they left behind, because every word felt like it was reaching for something that was no longer there to hear it. And now, he said, finally looking at her, his dark eyes warm in the firelight, I find that silence was never truly what I wanted. I think I simply needed someone worth breaking it for. She moved to him then, settling into his lap despite the practical concerns about the chair's sturdiness, and kissed him slowly, thoroughly, feeling his arms come around her with the particular gentleness he reserved only for her, and thought that she had never in her life felt so entirely certain of anything as she felt certain of this man's love, hard-won and deeply held as it was. Spring came at last, melting the snow from the hills and bringing new calves to the herd and green shoots to the garden Alberta had planted the previous fall, and with it came news that made both of them laugh with a kind of stunned joy that took several minutes to properly settle into understanding. "You are certain?" Silas asked, for perhaps the fifth time, staring at her as though she had announced something entirely beyond his comprehension, though the doctor from Prosperity Gulch, summoned specifically for this purpose, had been quite clear in his diagnosis. "I am as certain as the doctor can make me," Alberta said, laughing despite the slight nausea that had plagued her mornings for the past several weeks and that she now understood the source of. "We are going to have a child, Silas, come autumn if the doctor's calculations hold true." Silas sat down rather heavily on the porch step, and for a long moment said nothing at all, and Alberta, recognizing this particular silence as one born of overwhelming feeling rather than simple reticence, sat beside him and waited, her hand resting on his arm. "I did not think," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion she had rarely heard from him, "that I would have this. A family, Alberta. After Amos, after everything, I thought that part of my life was closed to me, that I had chosen, by closing myself off, to walk a different path than the one my brother walked. And now you are telling me we are to have a child, and I find I do not know how to hold the size of this feeling." "You do not have to hold it alone," she said gently. "That is rather the entire point of a marriage, Silas. We hold things together now." He turned to her then, and there were tears standing in his eyes, unashamed and unhidden, the first time she had seen him weep since she had known him, and he kissed her with a tenderness that spoke more clearly than any words could have of the depth of feeling he carried for her, for the child they had made together, for the future that stretched ahead of them now, full of possibility in a way it had not been full for a long while before her arrival. "I love you," he said, when the kiss ended, resting his forehead against hers the way he often did in moments of deep feeling. "I do not think I have said it enough, Alberta. I do not think there are enough words in the whole of the English language to say it as thoroughly as I feel it, but I love you, and I am grateful every single day that you climbed down off that stagecoach and refused to let my silence keep you at a distance." "I love you too," she said, her own tears falling freely now. "More than I know how to say, and you know how much I generally have to say about everything." He laughed at that, a real laugh, full and warm, and the sound of it, so rare and so precious, felt to Alberta like the truest measure of how far they had both traveled together since that first careful, silent wagon ride home from Prosperity Gulch. Their son was born in October, during a mild spell of weather that Alberta would always remember as a particular mercy, given how difficult the birth proved to be. She labored through a long night and into the following morning, with Mrs. Prout in attendance to assist, and Silas pacing the length of the porch outside, unable to bear being far from the house but equally unable to bear witnessing his wife's pain, until finally, as the sun climbed fully into the sky, the cry of a newborn child cut through the morning air, and Silas was ushered inside to meet his son. "He is perfect," Alberta said softly, exhausted but glowing with a joy that Silas had never seen on her face before, though he had seen a great many expressions of joy in the 2 years since her arrival. "Look at him, Silas. Look at what we have made together." Silas looked, and something in his chest that had been guarded and careful for so long simply broke open entirely, and he wept again, unashamed, holding his son for the first time with hands that trembled with a tenderness Alberta had come to know intimately over their years together. "What shall we name him?" Alberta asked, watching her husband cradle their child with an expression of such profound love that she thought her heart might simply overflow with the sight of it. "Amos," Silas said, without hesitation. "If you do not mind it, Alberta, I would like to give him my brother's name. I think Amos would have liked to know that something of him carried forward, even in a world that took him too soon." "I think that is a beautiful idea," Alberta said, reaching over to touch her son's small hand, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers that curled instinctively around her own. "Amos Ralston. It is a fine name for a fine boy." Little Amos grew quickly, as children do, filling the ranch house with sounds it had not held in years, laughter and crying, and the particular chaos that came with a small child determined to explore every corner of his world. Silas, to Alberta's continued delight, proved to be a devoted and gentle father, patient in a way that surprised even himself, spending long hours teaching his son the names of the mountains and the creek, and all the small details of the land that would, in time, become the boy's own inheritance. 2 years after Amos's birth, a daughter followed, whom they named Ruth after Alberta's own mother, and the ranch house that had once held only silence and careful grief now rang with the sounds of a full and happy family. 4 voices where once there had been only one careful, guarded man determined to keep the world at a distance. Garrett Voss was never heard from again in the territory, and the Circle R prospered in the years that followed, growing steadily under Silas's careful management and Alberta's equally careful bookkeeping, until it became one of the most respected ranches in that stretch of Wyoming territory, known not only for the quality of its cattle, but for the warmth of its hospitality, a reputation that Alberta, with her endless capacity for conversation and genuine interest in every person she met, had done a great deal to cultivate. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, Silas and Alberta sat together on the porch of the house they had built their life within, watching their 2 children play in the last golden light of a summer evening, and Alberta found herself thinking back to that first uncertain wagon ride, to the man who had told her plainly that he had no use for conversation, who had built walls so carefully around his grief that he had thought himself safe from ever loving anyone again. "Do you remember," she said, "what you told me that very first night about having no use for conversation?" "I remember," Silas said, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth, the same smile she had learned to recognize and treasure over the years, though it came far more easily to him now than it had in those early careful days. "I remember thinking I meant it entirely, too. I had convinced myself that silence was safer, that words led only to loss. And now—" He looked at her, his dark eyes warm with 5 years of accumulated love and trust, and the particular tenderness that came from building a whole life together, brick by careful brick, out of the wreckage of old grief. "Now I think," he said slowly, "that I have never in my life had more use for anything than I have for the sound of your voice, Alberta. I think I stopped pretending I wanted silence the very first evening you talked to me about mountains and tonic cellars, though it took me considerably longer to admit it to myself, let alone to you." "You were very stubborn about it," she said, laughing. "I was," he agreed. "But you were more stubborn still, and I am endlessly grateful for it. I do not know what kind of man I would have become, Alberta, if you had not refused to let my silence stand between us. I think I might have simply hardened into stone out here, alone with my grief and my cattle, and never known what I was missing." "Well," she said, leaning into him as their children's laughter carried across the yard, as the sun sank golden and warm over hills that had become, over 5 years, as much a part of her as the family she had left behind in Ohio. "I am glad I talked anyway. I am glad you stopped pretending you wanted to leave." "So am I," Silas said, and kissed her softly, the kind of kiss born not of new passion but of deep and abiding love, tested and proven through hardship and joy alike, a love that had grown from careful silence into something rich and full and entirely their own. "So am I, Alberta Ralston. More than I could ever properly say, though I imagine you will keep giving me reasons to try, for as long as we both shall live." "I intend to," she said, smiling against his shoulder as their children called out to them from the yard, as the ranch house behind them glowed warm with lamplight, as the whole wide sweep of Wyoming territory stretched out around them, no longer a strange and frightening unknown but simply home, simply theirs, built together out of hardship and love, and a stubborn refusal to let silence win. "I fully intend to talk your ear off for the rest of our days, Silas Ralston, and I do not believe, at this point, that you would have it any other way." "No," he agreed, pulling her closer as the evening settled soft and golden around them both. "I would not have it any other way at all." And so they remained, through many more years of hardship and harvest, of laughter and quiet evening conversations that no longer felt like a battle against silence, but like the simple, comfortable rhythm of two lives grown so thoroughly together that neither could properly imagine the other missing. Two people who had found, against every careful wall one of them had built, a love as steady and enduring as the Wyoming hills themselves. And just as beautiful in the changing light of every season they were given to share.